We'll be done with the book of Ephesians, and we'll move on to greener pastures. I'm sorry? 95 is our song of invitation, by the way. 95, if you want to go ahead and turn there, put your place markers. 95. All right, Ephesians chapter 5. Paul's continuing his lesson here, and he continues. Remember, book, chapter, and verse is a man-made invention. This is a letter, and we read it as we would a letter to anybody. We don't stop at a particular point and say, well, that thought's finished. Paul continues his thought. He says, and just read a little bit, therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children. So let's look at that first verse really quickly. When he says, therefore, what does that mean? Of necessity, what does that mean? Therefore, so we have to go backwards just a little bit, right? So he says, therefore, in regards to what I've just told you, then, you need to be imitators of God as beloved children. Well, what does he mean by imitators of God? Well, let's go right back to chapter 4, last verse 32. All right? Verse 31, of course, it talks about the negative things that we need to put away from ourselves, but then in verse 32, it gives us some very positive things that we need to be actively engaged in order for our conduct to be becoming. Okay, so let's look at those. Be kind to one another. Who's he speaking of here? When he says be kind to one another, who's he speaking to? Or speaking of? As Christians, how are we supposed to act towards one another? Be kind to one another. We're no longer in the world where it is dog eat dog and the strong survive and the weak are left in the dust. That's not the way we're supposed to be. As Christians, we're supposed to favor one another. We're supposed to give preference to one another. So we're supposed to be kind to one another, tender-hearted. Now, what does that entail? What does that entail? It means compassion needs to be at part of our Christian DNA, I like to call it. At the very heart of us, we need to be tender-hearted. We need to have compassion toward each other. Why is that necessary for us to have compassion? Why is it necessary for us to be tender-hearted? If we're not tender-hearted, what's the last part of this verse? Tender-hearted doing what? Forgiving. Can we be forgiving towards one another if we're not compassionate towards one another? If we remember the parable that Christ spoke, where he talks about the two servants, and one was forgiven and the other one was not forgiven, what was the mindset of that master towards that first servant? Remember what he says. He said what? What did he say about that master who forgave that first servant his debt? He said he took pity on him. He had compassion. So the idea of compassion, is that wrapped up in humankind, or is that a God-like quality? Is that a God-like quality? Certainly. What does it say in chapter 5 and verse 1? Therefore, what? If we have to be imitators, followers of God. So it says that compassion, that idea of that true tender-hearted compassion, is something that is wrapped up in a God-like nature. And if we are to be imitators of God, this needs to be part of our Christian DNA. Remember, if we're sons, who are we supposed to represent? Who do we resemble? The Father, okay? We talked about that the other day. The idea that, our children sometimes look like, one of them looks like the mom or the dad or whatever it might be. And it's true, especially as a Christian. Who are we going to represent or resemble? We're going to resemble our Heavenly Father. And that idea of being tender-hearted or compassionate towards one another must be at the very core of who we are. Because if we are not tender-hearted and compassionate towards one another, how can we possibly have a forgiving spirit? We can say that we're forgiving. We can go through the motions of forgiveness and the words that we say, yes, I forgive you. But at our very heart, if we're not tender-hearted, is that forgiveness true and real? No, it's certainly not. Those are simply words that are coming out of our mouth towards someone. And if our heart's not right towards them, we haven't truly forgiven them. Now, if we've said with our mouths they're forgiven, are they just because we held something in our heart, does that mean they're still not forgiven? No. If we say they're forgiven, their part in this is over and done with. It still falls to us, though, to have that tender and compassionate heart and to mean that forgiveness when we're supposed to. Okay? This says, therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children. So, as the Father is, so should we be. We are children of His. We are to resemble Him in every way that we possibly can. Be imitators. All right? And then continuing on, and walk in love. as Christ loved us. All right. So what is that? What is that? What that concept then? We walk in love as what Christ loved us. Okay. Let's go to Romans chapter 14, verse 15. Romans chapter 14, verse 15. Idea here about how do we walk in love. Let's go to Romans chapter 14, verse 13, and continuing on. Of course, the author of Romans is writing this, and he says, "Therefore, let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather, or instead, decide never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of a brother." Now, I think that should be fairly straightforward for us. That shouldn't be a question about why we shouldn't put a hindrance or stumbling block. Why would you put a stumbling block in front of somebody? Would you do that to somebody that you love? If you and your wife are walking down or husband or whoever it is, somebody that you love, you're walking together down a footpath, and you're starting to go down a hill. As someone that you love, would you stick out your foot and let them trip over it? No, of course not. What would you do instead? Help them down the path, right? You work your way down the path, and you lean upon one another. You help each other down this thing. It's the same thing that Christian brethren are supposed to do. You're supposed to walk down that pathway together, assisting one another. But it says in verse 14, "I know and am persuaded in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself, but it is unclean for anyone who thinks it unclean." So here's the brother that we're supposed to be giving preference to. "For if your brother is grieved by what you eat, you are no longer walking in love." So that idea of walking in love, continuing on, "by what you eat, do not destroy the one for whom Christ died." In other words, don't say, "I'm going to exercise my right to do things at the expense of my brother." If it's something that offends him or causes him to, okay, once again, putting that hindrance out, that stumbling block out, if we do that intentionally and knowing, saying, "I don't care if it hurts my brother, I'm going to do it because I have a liberty to do so." Paul said, why would you do something like that to your brother? That's not acting in love towards somebody. That's acting in a selfish way and acting as selfish concern. Well, it's my right to do so. Yes, it is your right to do so. Talking to the brethren here, your right to eat what you want and to not feel that you're being profaned by it is certainly your right. But if it causes your brother to stumble, then you're no longer looking out for your brother's best interest, and you're looking out for your own self-interest. Okay, so walk in love as Christ loved us. And what did he do for us as he loved us? Because he loved us, he gave himself up for us, but as what? A fragrant offering, and what? And sacrifice. Okay, now what do you think he's trying to pull? What do you think he's trying to bring to their memory when he says a fragrant offering and sacrifice? What would have? Huh? Okay. Yes. What else? Instead of the sacrifices offered up by the Israelites, who else would it have been? Who else would offer up sacrifices and things with pleasing aroma? No. Yeah, but it's not where he's. Remember, he's not talking to former Hebrews. Who's he speaking to? He's speaking to the Gentiles. Did the Gentiles offer up sacrifices? Yes. Remember, they would sacrifice. They sacrificed to their gods, same as the Israelites did. It was a pagan sacrifice. It certainly was, but they offered up animal sacrifices. That's why they said. That's why you had to be careful when they went into the marketplace to buy that meat, because why? It had been what? It had been offered up to strange gods. So yes, even the pagans offered up animal sacrifices in all the ways that the Israelites did. Only they were, of course, it was pagan. They weren't offering up to Yahweh. They were offering up to Apollos and Zeus and Diana and all of these pagan gods. What else were they offering up? The animal sacrifices, but what else? Yeah, human sacrifices, unfortunately. Remember, they would burn incense, and that was part of their worship. So these people would have understood this idea of a fragrant offering and sacrifice, but instead of a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to some pagan god that doesn't exist, by the way, and he made that abundantly clear, these pagan gods that they worship, he said these are non-entities. This is a man-made God. These people decided they needed a God, so they created a God. Instead, we worship the God that created us. We don't worship a God we created as Christians. Does the world do that? Yeah, they worship gods that they themselves created. They put themselves in the place of God. There are several denominations, false beliefs, that believe that they themselves are gods. Okay? So here he's saying he gave himself up. It was his sacrifice. The idea here, of course, that Christ was a sacrifice, but he was not an unwilling sacrifice, right? They didn't drag him kicking and screaming to the cross, did they? Okay, he went willingly. It says that as a matter of fact, his mouth was closed. He didn't even open his mouth to defend himself. He went willingly to the cross, okay? And he gave himself up for us in obedience to his Father, all right? So he gave himself up, and he was a fragrant offering and a sacrifice, but not to some pagan god. It was a fragrant offering and it was a sacrifice to the living God, Jehovah God, the God that exists, the God that through everything has its being. All right. So he's making this abundantly clear that when we're imitators, we're not a shadow of these things. We are imitators of a God that is real, a God that is alive, not a God made by hands. It's a God that with his hands made all things. So he's making this abundantly clear. That's why this first part of this chapter 5, you have to go back to chapter 4 and help you understand basically this is the end point of this thought. Okay? So he's giving them this idea about who this God truly is, what it means to be an imitator of God, and that it takes effort on our part. It's not something that just happens. We have to be actively involved in being an imitator. You're not a passive imitator, right? Can you be a passive imitator? No, that's just a resemblance. An imitator is what? Yeah, you're looking for something to look like. You're looking for something to emulate. And when it says that we're to be imitators, that means that we are looking toward God. And can we be an imitator if we don't know how someone? If you were to imitate somebody, I love the political season because you've got these guys that they find a particular candidate that they can just really they can resemble, and they replicate, and they do it for humorous purposes, right? How do you think those people are able to capture that character of that candidate so well? And they get those videos out and they watch them. They see their movements. And I remember when I was in college, it was Dana Carvey and President Bush, the first President Bush, and he had that mannerism down to a science. And it was so funny to watch him do it because, I mean, he just had it, had that just right. Even though he did it for comedy purposes, he still was able to imitate him really well. But in order to do that, he had to study. And he said, I would watch his speeches, I'd watch his mannerisms, and I'd try to copy it, and then I'd do it for somebody else. And it got to the point where actual President Bush said, I know you're doing that to make fun of me. He said, but you do a really good job. Would you mind coming and doing that character for some event at the White House? That's pretty impressive when the person that you're imitating says, that's really good, I want you to come and do this for me. Well, we can't be imitators of God unless we do what? We study him. We know what he is. We have to know what he's like. We have to know his character in order for us. If we're going to be imitators of him, we must know what? His character. We have to know how he is. We can't physically resemble him because he's a spiritual God, but we can certainly emulate his characteristics and qualities. And the idea here, of course, is walking in love and being kind to one another and tenderhearted and forgiving in all ways. Okay? All right, so let's move on a little bit further. But in opposition to what I just said, the idea of being an imitator of God, let's look at the things that are in opposition to God and see what we're supposed to put away from ourselves. But sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not what? Be named. What does it mean to be named among you? We can't find example. When someone looks at the church, let's just say instead of Ephesians, let's look at just put our name in there, Central Church of Christ. For example, if he's writing this and he's saying at the Central Church in Smyrna, Smyrna church, this is what I'm telling you. Sexual immorality and impurity and covetous must not what? We must not what? You're not supposed to see it here. Who's supposed to see it here? Or who's not supposed to see it here? Yeah, inside the building or outside the building. And a lot of churches feel that they've done their job when the outside world doesn't see what's going on. Well, we've accomplished our task because nobody in the community, nobody in the city at large, is able to see any kind of deficit in our character. And we've accomplished something if we're able to do that. We've been able to keep it contained. We keep it centralized. Yeah, we know what's going on, but nobody in the world does. Well, where's the problem with that? Where's the problem with that mindset? Well, yeah, certainly. God knows no matter what. God knows what's going on. Yeah, absolutely. Just because it's self-contained, does that mean it's not still destructive to the body? Yeah, absolutely. If just for example, if you go to the doctor and you're going from just your checkup, your physical that you go for once a year or however often, and they go in and they do all of the tests that they do. They look everywhere and they listen everywhere and they do all of this kind of stuff and they take this blood and they do all of this. You go through this whole exam and they say, hey man, everything's looking good. Go on home. So you go on home and all of a sudden, something's not quite right, something you're not feeling well, something kind of gives you a cause for concern and you go back and all of a sudden they say, well, okay, we'll run some more tests, and after a little bit more invasive procedures and testing, they realize that, and I'll just pull the one out that everybody thinks of, it's cancer, okay? Just because they didn't see the cancer at the first visit, does that mean that there was no cancer within you? No. Are there congregations that even though the world does not see the cancer that's inside that congregation, does that mean that there's nothing going on that needs to be addressed? No. Doesn't mean that at all. It means that sometimes we feel that we've kept it so hidden that somehow it ceases to exist. It will pass the notice of God because we've managed to keep it separated from the outside world. As if the outside world is our judge. Well, at least the world doesn't know what's going on. As if the world's capable of judging us in the first place. I'm not worried. I don't want you to take this the wrong way. What the outside world thinks of this congregation is not the most important thing, is it? What's the most important thing? How does God view this congregation? How does God view the body at Central? Because that's the most important. That's the viewpoint from which we derive everything else in how we see ourselves. And that's what Paul is telling them. This must not be named not only from the outside but from the inside. If I know what's going on, if I know something that's happening here, for example, if this whoever has gone to the doctor, and I look at them and I say, something doesn't seem right. You need to go back and have it checked. You think that person's going to be grateful for my input? Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're not. Are congregations like that? Some are. We had no idea. Thank you for telling us. We had no idea. What are some congregations' attitude towards it? Mind your own business. Mind your own business. We've got that under wraps. We've got that tamped down. You don't need to worry about that. Is that the way we're supposed to be? No. But he says here, sexual immorality, and that terminology here is it comes from the root word porneia. It's a Greek word which means sexual sin, and it encompasses everything. There's nothing that's left out there. A lot of people say, well, there's not fornication. Well, there's not this. There's not this particular specific type of sex. He says, no, that's not the point. Sexual sin is any kind of sexual activity outside of a married couple, man and woman. That's it. That's what it means by that terminology. It doesn't leave anything out. So any kind of sexual immorality is not to be found. What was one example that we read about in Corinthians? A man who was he was involved with his father's wife. Okay? Something that even the Gentiles didn't engage in. He said that is sexual immorality, and it was named among the brethren. instead of rejoicing and thinking yourselves blessed, you need to purge this out and get rid of it. He says, but sexual immorality and all impurity. So, for example, what? All impurity. Impurity means what? Uncleanliness, right? How are we supposed to keep the church? Clean. Our robes are to be white, not soiled. We're supposed to present ourselves appropriately before God. Clean. Keep the church clean. Is that easy to do? No. It's on the surface. It's very easy to do. We know what we're supposed to do. It's spelled out very specifically how we keep the church clean, how we keep the church pure. We address the problem. If the problem is not being addressed, and if we address it and this brother or sister in Christ refuses to hear, what do we do? What do we do? That's the end result. The end result is to purge that sin out from that congregation, no matter what it is. We purge it, and with the hope that the church can be restored, not with this. This is great. We got rid of a troublemaker. No, that's not the way it works. We mourn when we lose someone like that, because this is a brother or sister that is lost. They're outside and they need to be restored. But you know what? We have to do that sometimes. And I think we talk about, well, that's hard to do. It's hard to do because it's not done. If it were being done on a regular basis when it needed to be done, guess what? Congregation wouldn't think twice about enacting what we understand to be church discipline, what we read about in the Bible. That's just the phraseology we use for it. But if congregations were doing that on a regular basis with the understanding and people were being brought up in the knowledge that this is the way the church handles problems, it would be second nature to us. We wouldn't even think twice about it. Well, we know what we need to do. That's why, I always found it interesting, if you ever read about those groups that are very insular, like the Amish or the Mennonites, they have what's called church discipline, and they do these things. But everybody knows that that's the way things go. They understand, and they realize, and it's interesting that when it is enacted, even the people that it's enacted against, they understand it. They don't hold it against the church. Well, I know that's what's going on. I know that's what's going to happen. And when it happens, they walk away saying, well, they did what they're told to do. But with the Lord's body now, how often do you see that practiced? Almost never. And when it is, people act as if it's something that's just never been done before. But here we're told how to do it. And if we were doing it when we should be doing it, if every congregation did it when they should be doing it, it would no longer be such a huge thing. It would be something that would be expected. But leading up to that, of course, the idea, all impurity, the idea of something that's keeping the church from remaining true, remaining pure, with its robes remaining clean and white. All right? All impurity or covetousness must not be named among you, as is proper among saints. So it's telling us, as saints, there shouldn't be anything like this. But when it is, when it's found, it needs to be addressed. It needs to be taken care of immediately, not allowed to fester and grow like a cancer. Would it be nice if I knew that somebody might have the beginnings of cancer, didn't say anything to them? Well, I'll wait just a little bit. I'll give them a little bit of time. I'll get with them in about a month and let them know what I found. No. Why would you do something like that to somebody you love? Why would you do that to somebody you hated? I can't imagine anybody I hate enough that I would want a cancer to grow in their body without giving them some sort of a warning. But anyway, it says, as is proper among saints, the brethren, let there be no filthiness or foolish talk or crude joking. I think that's pretty straightforward, don't you? We have become a very impolite society. And the idea here that we say whatever comes into our minds, no matter how profane or ignorant, sometimes just ignorant speech, the idea of profanity and talk that should not be found among brethren, especially. Even in the world, it's inappropriate, but especially among brethren, that's not something that's supposed to be found. And it's something that can be tamped down. Is it easy to do? It's like any habit, right? It's a habit that grows in us, and it gets to the point. I've run into people that it seems that every other word in their vocabulary is some form of profanity. And they speak like that, they talk like that, they speak to one another like that. They speak to anybody that they encounter like that. And it's difficult to carry on a conversation because and as it should for Christians, when you hear something like that, it should burn our ears. It should be something that makes us uncomfortable to be in its presence. Now, are people in the world going to speak like that? Yes, but not in the church. Certainly shouldn't be heard among the saints. Well, it's just, it's not really profane. It's maybe impolite. Okay, maybe it's just impolite. What does it say? Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk. That's just silliness, something that has no purpose. No foolish talk, nor crude joking. I don't know about you, but I've been among even Christian men that all of a sudden somebody tells a little anecdote or a joke or something, and you think, oh, well, no, it's just us guys. No, that's not what it says. It doesn't say, let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, unless it's just the men. No, it doesn't say that. It says not among the saints. Are men saints? Yes. So should that be heard even amongst men in a group? No. That's not the way we're supposed to be. All right? But instead, nor crude joking, which are out of place. Which means what? It's inappropriate wherever you do it. It's out of place. It's not where it's supposed to be. That when it means out of place, it doesn't mean that you can't say it inside the church building, but when you go get together at somebody's house that it would be appropriate. It's out of place where? Among the saints. Not just in the building, not just in a classroom setting, not just in the annex next door. It means it's out of place among the saints. It's not supposed to be heard from our mouth, coming out of our mouth. Our speech is supposed to be clean. Okay? We don't engage in that kind of behavior. So, yes.
We can't talk that kind of language around Bill Clinton, but he's one of these people that belong to the church, things like that. Yeah. It's a sense of respect, but it also
it is.
That way.
Absolutely.
When I take it that way, it's a good thing that they know they don't use that kind of language around me because I make it know that I'm a Christian and I don't tolerate it.
Yeah.
I can't stop them, but if they make, here comes something, we can't use that kind of language. Well, it's a sense of respect.
It is.
I take it as respect. At least they know they don't use that kind of language around me.
I agree. I run into that. I was with a group of guys. We were out. It was at the golf course. It was at one of the tournaments, and I was out with a group of guys, and they were carousing and talking it up, and and I'm just I'm keeping my peace, and then they started asking. They knew each other, and they said, "Well, what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a preacher." It's like you could hear the brakes being put on. And from that point on, it changed. And what was even more interesting is when one of them would say something, and they'd look at me real quick. Oh, I'm sorry. And I'm thinking, well, I'm not sure why in the world you make such a big deal just because I'm a preacher. Why wouldn't you just say that? Because it's just inappropriate to talk that way. It's just inappropriate. It's not the point. Your point and whatever you're saying is not made any better. It's not made any more valid, and it certainly doesn't carry any more weight because you attach, filthy language to it. It just doesn't do anything. But that's once again gets in that idea of the mindset of the world. It gets in the mindset of the world. It's perfectly acceptable as long as everybody's okay with it. And if you're not, well, we'll stop, but we'll make sure you understand we're stopping because you're cool enough with the rest of us to be a party of it and to engage in it. But I agree, and I'm the same way. I kind of take it as a compliment. Well, that's fine. Whatever, but it tells us very specifically. It's especially out of place amongst the brethren. It's not supposed to be found. If it's a bunch of ladies sitting around, and I found, guess what? Women can be just as crude and just as nasty in their speech as men can. If you get a group of them together, it's just like guys. Everybody used to talk about locker room talk. That was guys. Not anymore. Not anymore. You get some young ladies together, or even older ladies, and they can be just as foul and just as nasty in their speech as men can be. So what does that tell us? that the saints among us, anyway, we're not supposed to be found. And that's why I've always enjoyed get-togethers with brethren. I can bring anybody from outside in there, and I'm not going to have to apologize to my friends because the people that I attend church with are engaged in that kind of behavior. You know, there's not inappropriate comments. There's not inappropriate jokes. There's nothing I don't have to go, oh, I'm sorry. If anything, I might have to apologize for the friend that I bring because they may say something. And I found that, you know what, when I bring people in, their speech improves because, oh, we're among church people. You know, that's good. That shows that there's an attitude towards people of faith that should be even amongst the brethren, right? It's supposed to be that way. But instead, look at what our speech is supposed to be replaced with. Take out that stuff that you used to use, the filthiness and foolish talking and crude joking. Those are out of place. But instead, what? Let there be thanksgiving. Let there be an attitude of gratitude, as the saying goes. All right? Praiseworthy speech. The idea here is that we don't fill our time with idle conversations and silly talk. Instead, we replace it with something that's beneficial to us. And it's another reason that I enjoy spending time with brethren. I'm of the opinion that I can have a fellowship meal any day of the week and twice on Sundays, literally. Because I get so much out of the topics of discussion. I get so much out of the discussion I have with brothers and sisters in Christ. Our conversation is beneficial to me. It's uplifting. It builds me up. I don't get out there and come out and go, man, that was 2 hours wasted. I come out and say, I feel better about my life. I feel better about my relationship with God. I feel better about my relationship with my brothers and sisters in Christ. Because our conversation is praiseworthy. It's good. It's decent. It contains something of substance to it, and it builds us up, and that's the way it should be. But let there be thanksgiving in our speech. For you may be sure of this, starting in verse 5, for you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure or who is covetous, that is an idolater, someone who worships at a false god, not necessarily a statue or an actual god, but anything that they put in place of God, has no inheritance in the kingdom of God or in the kingdom of Christ and God. This kind of flies in the face of the way the world believes, doesn't it? That this is something to be overlooked. This is not something that's going to keep us out of heaven. Just because you choose to, engage in that kind of behavior doesn't mean that you're going to. Don't let that fool you. You're not going to hell just because you do this, this, and this. But it says very emphatically the opposite of that. Everyone who is sexually immoral or impure or is covetous or an idolater has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. So we need to be very careful about letting things slide and not confronting that very unrealistic attitude. They're saying, oh yeah, I understand if you don't do this, if you do this or this, then yeah, you can lose your salvation. But let's be honest. Everybody is going to be involved in that. Everybody's going to do it. We just need to open up a little bit. We need to be more progressive in our thought towards that kind of behavior. And that's not what the Bible says. And we got to be careful to speak where the Bible speaks. And it says this person has no inheritance. What could be worse than not telling somebody that their behavior is going to keep them out of heaven? I can't think of anything worse for us to do. Because when we've done that, what have we thrown up? A stumbling block. And I like to look at it as we've done the opposite of. Let me tell you this. Let me put it this way. Rather than throwing up a stumbling block, what we've done is we've done the opposite. We've taken away the stumbling block, but then we've put a hole in for them to fall in. Let's just go the opposite direction. Both are just as bad. Both of them are just as likely to start somebody to stumble and fall. But that's what we've done. We've put a giant pit in their way. It's the pit of sexual immorality. And they need to stay away from it. There can be nothing worse than to lose your salvation over indulging in the desires of the flesh. There can't be anything worse than that. Can you imagine that? To do all of these other things, but because we could not control ourselves physically, that we lose our inheritance. And that's a sad thing, but there are so many people, even amongst the brethren, that are going to be lost because of this attitude. Yeah. Yeah.
You mean to tell them your God don't have merciful work hard, and I'm carving this, and I'm doing, I can't help myself. And you mean to tell me this God is not going to, it's going to look at that and call it and send me to hell? What kind of God did you serve?
Well, I look at it go even worse, as I've had people say this very specifically. God made me this way. God made me, He's the one that designed me. He's the one that built me. He's the one responsible for these desires of the flesh. You think he's going to send me to hell because I engaged in the very activity that he caused me to enjoy and want to be a part of? Well, nothing. Well, there's nothing like blaming God for your condemnation. Why would God do something like that? What kind of loving God would build me with these kind of desires and then say that I cannot indulge in them, I cannot engage in them? Well, I'd be careful about pointing fingers at God, okay? Be very careful about pointing fingers at God. God also, the idea that we can't control ourselves, God also designed us to, I'm just not going to be indelicate here. God designed us to go to the restroom, right? But do we go out on the corner and use the restroom? Or do we go into one of these nice facilities that we have in here? So don't tell me that we can't control ourselves. Both of them are biological functions. You're saying that you can control that, but you can control that, but you can't control the physical desires of the flesh? What kind of person are you? I mean, you're not an animal. Animals go to the bathroom on the side of the road. But you're saying that you're no better than an animal, that you can't control the desires of the flesh? No. And the Bible says very specifically that we can. It says that we can't. God wouldn't tell us to do something that we cannot do. And he says, let there be no sexual immorality. So he's telling us that what? We can be sexually pure. We can control ourselves in that way. And if we cannot, or I will never say we cannot, if we will not control ourselves, then yes, we can lose our inheritance. Yes, ma'am. And the idea, if someone like that knows that they're that's one of those things where it hits a very sensitive nerve. But the idea there that is a desire that God has built into them, and therefore it's acceptable to engage in. There's a fellow that's he's a blogger, and they actually had a couple of meetings that they were having across the country. He is pro-rape. He said that there is no such thing as rape. That it is a biological function, and to deny it is unhealthy and it's inhuman. That shows you the attitude of the world in which we live. Those who've given themselves there's a lot of ladies going, yes, there is. There very much is a problem with that, and I agree. I mean, that's one of those things where I don't know what I would do if I ever saw somebody doing something like that to someone. I'd probably go to jail. But there you go. That's that mindset. The idea that I cannot control myself, therefore I will not control myself. I will indulge whatever I want to indulge in. Well, yeah. 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 There is a sense of shame. Yes. Yes. I read an article, it's been several years ago, the idea that we've lost the ability to blush. And what do you think how does that trickle down to us? We've lost the, now I'm not saying that we physically have lost the ability, but what does that mean? We've lost the ability to blush. Yeah, nothing shocks us anymore, right? People will, but I've found that that's not entirely true. I've found that really and honestly, even young people who, we accuse young people of being everything, amoral, immoral, whatever, that they have no control over themselves. And I found that, guess what? They do. There still is a sense. The problem is that the world will not allow itself to be ruled by anything other than itself. The world will not allow itself to be ruled by God. Therefore, it is ruled by Satan in the form of ourselves. Okay, we say, well, no, I'm in control of my life. Well, that's a nice illusion you've got going on there, and good luck with that, but that's not really the case. You say you're in control of your life, but you're not really in control of your life. You just think you're in control of your life. However, God rules my life, and I brook no illusions about it. It's a funny thing. God's in control of my life, even though sometimes I think I am. God's really in control of it. And everything I do, I try my best to allow it to be dictated, not a benevolent guidance. I allow my life to be dictated by God. Well, nobody's going to tell me what to do. Well, then somebody already is. Somebody already is. Okay? So, and verse continuing, has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Verse 6, let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. What do you think? That's an interesting turn of phrase, the idea, let no one deceive you with empty words. What is he saying here? What is he telling these Ephesians? Now, you understand, when Paul's writing to the Ephesians, do his words carry weight? Yes. His words are full of something, aren't they? But here he's saying, when people give you empty words, what is he talking about here with empty words? They have no weight. But who's he talking? Who's he referring to? The idea of who? Say, yep. Prattle about nothing. Yeah. There's no those who deliver not just the idea, and that's true. Sometimes people just talk. You ever somebody just talk and they talk and they talk? They're not saying a word. There's nothing really of any importance being said. Yeah. What about false doctrine? Are those empty words? Those are empty words too. There's nothing behind them. They claim to have some great knowledge. They claim to be some great authority. They tell you all of these things, and it sounds so good. I don't know how many times. I'm sorry, I have to apologize. I still get involved in online debates. I said I wasn't going to do that anymore, but sometimes somebody will say something, and I have to grab my computer. And I said, I don't need to wade into this. All this is going to do is aggravate me. Okay, it's just going to aggravate me. It's like wrestling with a pig, right? I'm the only one that's going to get dirty and be unhappy. The pig loves it. So I have to sit there and grip, but sometimes I can't. I have to answer it. And I answer it, and sure enough, there's somebody behind that keyboard, could be on the other side of the world, and they speak. You just don't know what you're talking about. Studies have shown, and evidence shows, and this has been disproven, and all of these things. And I realize that these are the people that he's talking about here. These are the people who fill my head with empty words. There's nothing behind it. Because is there anything behind what is not of God? There's nothing there. It's emptiness, and it will avail me nothing. I'm not benefited by it. I'm not edified by it. I'm not strengthened by it. There's nothing that's progressing me forward, and I have to be careful. And I believe me, I know even when I'm typing it and I hit that enter button, I realize what I'm doing is I'm swimming against the current, and then somebody takes away my paddle. That's exactly what's happening. But it just, anyway. But it says, for because of these things, these empty words, all this stuff, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Now, who's he talking about, the sons of disobedience? Yes, those who are speaking against, and those Christians who listen. Those Christians who after having heard the word of God, now decide that they know they want something different. There's something else that they're going to anchor themselves in. So those sons of disobedience are both. It's both those outside of the church and those inside the church who give weight to those empty words. And there are people in the church who continue to give weight to words that they're carried about by all kinds of doctrine, right? We read about that earlier in the chapter. They're to and fro. There's nothing there, but they weren't firmly anchored, so they hear this word. I had a friend that was, I went to school with him, went to college with him, and he was I believed, a faithful member at the time, and it didn't look like there was going to be a problem. Now, he's gotten off in this just all kinds of weird, that idea we were talking about at lunch, the idea of the third eye and Illuminati and these people who have they're in charge of everything, and he's just wrapped up in all of this conspiracy. And he said, he tries to bring in the Christianity. He said, Jesus was actually part of this big thing, but he was trying to bring truth to the masses. And these other people who were part of this big world order didn't want him to say these things, and that's why he was crucified. And I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm still trying to make sense out of all that. Well, who are these people? Well, they're part of our everyday society. You wouldn't know them if you saw them. So there we go. Once again, the idea of empty words. And there's people who are pulled away from the truth because of these things, because they act like they know what they're talking about. They don't flounder about. Man, they come in it with authority. They know what they're saying. And they'll tell you, and they pull people away because they have said something. There's something about that just attracts somebody, and they're not firmly anchored in the faith, and they're pulled away. And there they go. And you go and you talk to them, and they just keep heading out of that harbor. And finally you just have to say, bye. I don't know, what else can you do? But this is what's going to happen because of these things, because of these empty words, because of this pulling away. The wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. And this concept of the sons of disobedience. Actually, go back if you want to go back, you don't have to. In chapter 2, it's in chapter 2 and verse 2. It says, "In which you once walked." Okay, this is where you once were, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience. This is what's going to happen. Among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. So who is he talking about? The sons of disobedience? It's those who are still in the world. And those Christians who, after hearing the truth, obeying the word, becoming Christians, they go back into the world as well. And there they go. All they've done is gone back. They're wallowing in the mire again. They've turned back to the vomit, like the dog does. They're back to wallowing in the mire like the pig does after it's been washed off. Okay, therefore, speaking about these things, therefore, after hearing this, therefore what? Do not what? Do not become partners with or partakers of what? Of their deeds. Don't go back to that. Don't hit yourself to them again. It's like when you hitch up I've never been a part of this, but anybody here ever remember hitching up a team of mules or oxen to plow? I don't know. Does anybody remember doing that? Anybody? Okay. When you hitch up a team too, do you mismatch the team? What happens? All of a sudden you look at that plow, you look at that furrow, and that furrow goes. Why? Because the stronger one's going to pull that weaker one off. So we have to be careful about where we hitch our wagon to. Okay? We need to rely on one another. We need to hitch our wagons to each other. We need to stick together, band together. So therefore, do not become partners with them in any way. Why would we intentionally yoke ourselves to an unbeliever? Now, that idea, this is not speaking of marriage. Marriage was never referred to as a yoke. Understand that. That's not the same thing. But do not become partners. Do not be yoked together with the unbelievers. Don't engage in their deeds with them. Don't engage in activities with them that will allow you to be pulled away from the truth. And that should be fairly straightforward. It should be something that's purely common sense. But guess what? Common sense isn't always so common. So do not therefore become partners with them. For at one time you were darkness. Well, that goes back to what we're talking about in chapter 2, right? We once engaged in the behavior of the flesh and the lust of the flesh. And once we were darkness. We were outside of God. God is light. Okay, so once we were outside of Him, but now you are light in the Lord. So, hey, don't get involved in that. Don't go back to that. Don't yoke yourself to them. Don't become partners with them. Don't engage in their deeds because they are walking in darkness. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true. I don't know why you would want to be anything other than good and right and true, right? Can you think of any reason you would want to be found in darkness? No, I can't think of anything. All right, and then real quick, and try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. So it's something that we have to work at, right? We have to concentrate on. We have to look at, study, to discern what is right to the Lord. God doesn't just give us a laundry list of things. If you do this, 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 and this, you're good with me. He says we discern that. We look, we read the Scriptures, we look at all of these things, and when we do that, we are able to discern that which is right. And if we can discern that which is right, it tells us that that's what we're supposed to be engaging in. Okay? All right. We're going to go ahead and finish up here, and then we'll finish this up next week, and then we'll get into the last chapter of Ephesians, chapter 6. I'm going to give an opportunity if anyone needs to avail themselves of the Lord's invitation. We certainly invite that at every opportunity, and if you need the prayers of the congregation in any way, if you need to make things right with God, if you need to become a New Testament Christian, whatever need you might have, we invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.